Welcome to this continuation of this conversation between three of the United Kingdom's leading iconographers. This conversation begins by looking at the phenomena of high-quality printed materials and the challenges that these provide for those trying to make a living from their iconography and those committed to the vision of iconography as a living part of the Church's liturgical tradition.
Things. I would imagine that unless you're talking extraordinarily high-end, expensive fine art printing on an enormous scale, anything that's done cheaply on a machine in 100 years, all you'll see, it'll just be blue.
Oh yeah. I mean, absolutely. I told them that. I told them that. I said, well, this is not going to survive you or your children, right? But it's the immediacy. You see, that is really what makes the immediacy. But it's not necessarily that much cheaper, because some of those prints cost a lot of money on those kind of scales. Yeah, that's a big problem. That's a big problem, really, really, because if you're going to replace. You see, iconography really thrives through demand and supply, right? And if there is no demand, then there is no supply. It's like an organic thing. If nobody comes to say, okay, can I have an icon of this and that for my church, right? Then there is no, there is nothing there. So,
but Stephane, to be fair, if I was a parish priest somewhere with not a great budget,
yes,
and the few iconographers of a really good standard that I was aware of were booked up for the next 5 years, say. We're trying to decorate the church now. The priest doesn't know if he's going to be there in 5 years' time. Somebody's willing to give the money. The sort of practical realities of normal parish pastoral life. It's the only thing we're really saying to them is, well, you're going to do us out of business. It's a sort of commercial consideration. What is that really what you'd say?
I wouldn't say that at all. As a matter of fact, I am more than always willing to work with them. I don't want to make them to make a parish to put a parish in a difficult spot or so I'm always willing to. You see, I'm not doing this for the money, right?
Sure. But what I was trying to get at, Stephane, was if you were trying to convince our listeners on this conversation that it really is worth a real live painted icon really has something which is worth the weight, the patience, the investment of resources. I mean, gentlemen, I'll throw that out to everybody. What
if they, I'll just say this, right? If the person who commissions it does not know that, then I shouldn't have to really convince them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I mean, I'd much rather work with somebody who seeks me out and wants, some work by me, rather than go and try and convince anyone that my work is better than this or that. I mean, this is
sure.
It's not what it's about, really.
I think, Ian, a distinction needs to be made here between large-scale, let's call them wallpaper icons, which are really replacing wall paintings, and small amount of prints, which perhaps the parish needs for a year or two while they're waiting. And I think a small amount of prints would be acceptable in a situation where either because the iconographers are booked up for a while or they haven't got the money immediately, at least to get the ball rolling. Some printed icons, but making it clear to the parish that these are only fill-ins until we get real ones. But don't plaster lesser ones around the walls because you feel you've got to cover every space with icons no matter what. So perhaps that'll be a compromise. I've done myself with the parish that started in Rugby. We had small mounted prints there that, it was made plain that these were the stand-ins. It's a new mission patch. And then gradually these were replaced with painted ones.
Why would you say, though, that in the end they should be painted with actual painted icons? What would you be your argument there?
I think the various parts to iconography. One is to end up with a finished result, which is the icon of a saint, and we pray in front of that icon. But the other is the actual act of making an icon is a liturgical act. It expresses the priestly role of the church to gather up God-given good things from creation and make them into something that's very good. Right. So though it's only an individual iconographer who does it, he or she is doing it on behalf of the whole church. A bit like a priest, I suppose, preparing a sermon. He doesn't just quote from the fathers, he assimilates the fathers and transforms them, and then delivers these new words to a particular parish that he has. So it's a pastoral thing and a transfiguration of the teaching of the church into a particular place. So I think you lose that priestly role expressed through the iconography if you just have prints. That's just one element. I mean, plenty of others, but that's the first that comes to mind in answering that.
I mean, I think that is really, in one sense, that makes that really clear, to talk about that priestly role, which is the function of all Christians, the letter to the Hebrews and so forth. So it's part of our vocation is to be priestly in the midst of creation. And the iconography is one particular function of that. I suppose the guy who has the printing business might say, well, I'm doing my part as well by, using the machinery and developing it and so forth. And I mean, you do find, I think quite interestingly, some miraculous weeping icons with myrrh-bearing icons, which are prints, very humble, simple things. I think there is something about the humility of the materials and so forth that is somehow still cherished. A little bit like the widow's mite. She might not have very much, but what she offers from the heart.
Yeah.
So I think
that is true.
There's an element I think like you were saying earlier, it's humility, it's the spiritual life of the iconographer, and I think that also goes towards, seeing our hard work put next to something that's, been bashed out on some printer somewhere and picked up on holiday, but has really been cherished as that doorway, that gateway from heaven to earth, and God is not stuffy and only using, Buckingham Palace. He's quite prepared to, inhabit some little tent on a beach. That I think we mustn't lose sight of that. But I think when we talk about the priestly role that we're involved in, and also I think the thing that strikes me is, Peter, you've been talking about some of the icons that still inspire you from the past. And these are the basis that people are making the reproductions on, because those originals inspire, and it's a sort of reflected glory in the printed material. If you didn't have those originals...
I've actually been in a shop in Thessalonica and seen reproductions for sale of Aidan's icons and my icons.
Oh, that's wonderful. There you are. You've made it. You've been gentlemen, the button is about to go. Just log back in and we'll continue the conversation, okay?
I think going back to our thing of mounted prints, I think partially an issue is what priority parishioners give to the quality of their worship. In this case, the icons as part of the worship. I think it's a danger that we think of icons as something you just slip into the gaps if you've got a bit of money left over.
Yeah.
But it ought to be treated as the most important room in your house. And the church is their church. It's not the priest's church. It's not owned by the archbishop. This is their house. So even poorer parishes, if each person gives it a certain priority, you know, that they can put their little bit in, and you can get one original icon, you know, by if you've got 15 people even. It doesn't require a lot of money.
Crowdfunding.
Yes.
Parish funding.
Yeah. And it's their icon, you know, it's not owned by the church, it's their work. So I'm a bit suspicious when people say our parish just can't afford anything at all. Well, what's your priority?
Especially when they've just put in a whole suite of new toilets or something. You know, where is your priority? You know, you could have a bucket. You don't need it. You could have something like, what's your priority? I think
you need a gilded icon and a hole in the ground.
Yeah.
There's an idea, you see, where people use, you know, the word decoration, right? Oh, we want to decorate our church.
Yeah.
And personally, I dislike this word in this context because, you see, I use the word adorn, right? And decoration is basically, they decorate the church like they would decorate a room in their house, right? And you know, the chandeliers are always very important, and they're willing to pay thousands and thousands for the chandeliers. But then when it comes to, you know, the iconography is usually an afterthought, and so you know, it's whatever is left, and even then, so you know, decoration is not really what, you know, parishioners should be thinking when it comes to the church. I usually say, you know, tell them about the Temple of Solomon. I mean, you know, when they built the temple, they didn't go and get the cheapest stuff. You know, they didn't go to IKEA and stuff.
Yeah,
they got the best of everything, the best craftsmen, the best materials, and so on. So, you know, it's God's house, basically. So yeah. I can't remember who it was. It may have been Clement of Alexandria who said that nothing should be in a church that is false, right, or that pretends to be something it's not.
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought that is a very good saying. That's a very good saying, because Satan is the father of liars. So here we go. I mean, when it comes to prints, again, I totally agree with Aidan. When, you know, if it's done in a sort of temporary way, and there's an understanding that it will, you know, be replaced, and so on, then, you know, of course it's a different thing. But when it becomes the norm, you know, that is when it becomes worrying, because then it means, what does it mean? It means basically that the tradition, the iconographic tradition, is dying. And,
but I also agree with something Aidan said last week, which was that it's up to, you know, the parish priest, the people who are commissioning these things, to know the difference. You know, that should be part of their training.
The training.
Yeah.
I wondered if, Ian, if we could discuss a bit practical ways in which good, serious, long-term training of iconographers might be brought forward, because the subject comes up again and again. I mean, a number of years ago, working with the Prince of Wales, I was exploring a full-time liturgical arts centre where people could study full-time, or perhaps of two areas, one full-time and those who couldn't go full-time, part-time courses, which would total up to the same number of hours as a full-time. In the end, it couldn't happen, so that's when I started the certificate course. But I'm aware also that this part-time certificate course is only a foundation. So you have all sorts of practical problems, like unless you've got a full-time course, you can't get overseas people coming over, because they can't get a visa. If it's full-time, but it's not accredited, they can't get student loans. So if you go to university and have a full-time accredited course, then the danger is that a secular university starts to dictate to the teachers what they've got to teach and what they can't teach. So then the ideal is probably an apprenticeship. So that's got to be funded in some way. I mean, I've had 2 apprentices. So with Martin, he didn't pay me any money to teach him, but basically I would employ him to help out. And I just happened to have enough sort of work and the right sort of work where more than one person could make it. Yeah. So that worked out quite well. Whereas other students, I haven't had enough of that sort of work. Like you can't, 2 people painting a panel icon at once. So Jim has had to pay me per hour. But he had enough money saved, but most people haven't got that. So what do? Do you look for a wealthy patron who will say, I will fund up to 2 apprentices a year, sort of thing, for 5 years? I think there's some practical issues to look at. How can we somehow establish a system, financial or whatever, academic, so that if we do get someone who's gifted and wants to learn and is willing to give time, we need some system that this can actually happen.
Yeah.
I just wonder now altogether if anyone has ideas how we can move this forward.
But I think you're right. I think funding is and accreditation are the problems. Unless people aren't prepared to spend a huge amount of money or something that they're not going to get a certificate or a degree or a postgraduate certificate from. So then it becomes something that's private. You have to find alternative solutions, as you have, and I have in a small way at St. Peter's in Canterbury with people coming. But I would love to be, just down the road we have Christchurch University, which was connected with the cathedral and was originally a semi-seminary, and it should really be something that's attached to or related to that maybe those old church universities, like you have in Oxford and Canterbury, and maybe somewhere like that, because as you say, there would be so much interference and so much paperwork involved in becoming an actual 3-year university degree course. It would just become a logistical nightmare.
I think there are places like, for instance, like the way it happened in Paris with Ouspensky, where he was attached to l'Institut Saint-Serge, right? Or you could have a place like in New York, Saint Vladimir Seminary, right? I mean, places like that could have courses in iconography attached to them, and that is one way of going about it. But I think that patronage is very important. Actually, throughout history, the best iconographic projects were done with patronage, either from the crown, either from the church, or whatever. I mean, what's happening in Russia now? There's great patronage from the state, even for iconography. So I think, and going back to what Aidan was saying about Martin, I mean, this is the typical traditional way to learn iconography. This is how I learned, started by helping making panels and doing this and this and that in the studio. You become involved in the studio, and that's the best way of learning, and that is how it's been done. So if you try to transpose that now into a kind of university setting or college setting, with formal courses and lectures and so on, it becomes something quite different. I mean, personally, I feel very privileged to have been able to go through this training for 6 or 7 years on the Isaac Fanous.
But I think in Orthodox countries, like in Russia, like in Moscow and in Athens, and you have these departments which are part of the theological schools. You have George Cordis in Athens, and people in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they're traditionally part of it. It's a department of the theological department.
But isn't that, I think, part of the paucity for those of us in the West? It's about the wider cultural context. Art is part of culture. Iconography is a part of art. If you're in an Orthodox steeped context, then you've got the whole apparatus of the way people think about life, reality, what education is, and so forth. In a secular Western context like England, especially with our secularism, I think part of the problem is that the wider context is really working against us, or at least is indifferent. And even within the church. So, when we were running the Icon School in Bethlehem, and we'd have groups of clergy and laity coming on pilgrimage, and I used to actually have a perverse enjoyment of raising up with the bishops who came and saying, well, how many hours do your priests get studying sacred art or liturgical art? And comparing that to how much time they have on Bible study. And it will be one session at most over a 7-year course. And then when you sort of raise the whole thing that in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, it says that in the liturgy, scripture and the icons are of equal value, there's a sort of shocked moment of realization that maybe they've sort of missed something somewhere. But yes. This, I think, certainly in the Western context, the cerebralization of the church and of our culture means that people really don't understand art anyway, and especially liturgical art. So even in the church, getting it sort of tagged on to a seminary or a theological institute wouldn't necessarily solve really the fundamental problem, which is why I think, Aidan, where it's been so fruitful has been when people can actually study with you as an apprentice, where it's the complete environment. That brings something, and you've got that theological knowledge and wisdom to be able to do more than just train them to paint. So that's an important element in that. So I really do think, I'm not saying what the answer is, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the real challenge that we face here, which really isn't faced by people in Russia or Greece, certainly.
Obviously.
Well, perhaps given that probably the most effective and the most practically workable way forward is apprenticeships. I think we need some sort of scholarship system so that you're not limiting an apprenticeship just to those who can afford to pay the accommodation, because initially they're not going to be painting many icons. The whole idea is that they're students.
Yeah.
And the master can't always guarantee they'll have work that they could paint the grass blades, whatever, on and pay them a few pounds an hour to do that. So there's got to be an assurance that the person can do their 5-year apprenticeship, whatever it is, and still have their rent paid. So that needs basically an external scholarship. Once you've got that, not that you'd accept everyone who wants to study under you, and I think all 4 of us here wouldn't want to spend 80% of our time teaching an apprentice. I found myself that even 2 hours a week is sufficient, and then homework is sufficient.
Lots of homework.
Sorry?
Lots of homework.
Yeah, lots of, exactly, yeah. And assessment regularly. So perhaps even 1 hour a week, lots of homework. So that's basically they're working 40 hours a week. But your own input as the teacher needn't be a vast amount every week. But that student needs to know that their bills can be paid. They don't have the hassle of having to stop and start all the time.
And maybe we need to be maybe more flexible. With the discovery of Zoom, I've been running a couple of courses just simply because of the situation, but I've actually found that this has really got a lot going for it in terms of the educational process, because by doing a course where there's one session a week, for example, that lasts for an hour, for people who have to work and who are really strapped in terms of finances, so they can't take time out to go and do a 5-day course or a 7-day course very easily. It's something that they can only financially think about once every couple of years. I mean, they're really trapped. But by having building a community of people who are learning online, you begin to break down some of those barriers. And I think one of the things I've heard a number of times over the years is that, well, iconography is great, but it's for people with money, because you've got to have such a level of income to be able to participate. And, you know, I don't believe the Holy Spirit is particularly choosing the wealthy to be the people who fulfill their vocation in this. So I think a sort of willingness to explore a multifaceted approach. So it may be that, for example, that we develop online resources which sort of also bring people together, because I think having people in relationship with each other, building a sense of community, and like we're doing, having a conversation together, is as important as being able to pore over the sources, to be able to do your homework. It's building communities of people where the wisdom is sort of broken open. And I mean, the thing that you were saying, like in Egypt with Dr. Fanous, if you only got one person, then suddenly that person goes and the whole thing goes into aspect. Whereas if we've got dynamic communities where, you know, people are really aware of each other and involved in conversations which broaden the wisdom, then you've got something which is more sustainable, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
I think what we, and you said this, Stephane, a little while ago, is that we've got to be careful that the training we do doesn't end up producing a whole community of mediocre iconographers. So I think we've got to respond to those who are interested, but I'm just afraid that I'm end up investing time just to produce, actually compound the problem by having a lot of half-trained DIY people who are trained enough to give them confidence, but not enough to make them really good. So, but I do agree that certain aspects of the training can be done on over the internet, certainly. I mean, it's a bit clumsy when it comes down to the practical things, and I find it rather awkward in the long term. I'd use it as a stopgap, but I think one is limited how much you can train people in the skill with them not being physically present. But you know, it's.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely correct, Aidan, because I've been running a WhatsApp group with some of my students over the lockdown, and in some ways it's been fabulous. It's been excellent, but because it's not live action, you have to have a lot of teaching materials ready that you can upload as images, and then you're dealing with constant questions and queries all the time. And if you've got your Canadians, you know, Mark Charlton and so forth, you don't start getting the emails till midnight. But I found that so much of what I'm writing about, trying to explain, is something about how something feels, which is really difficult. You know, if somebody's not beside you explaining, you know, watch it dry, it needs to feel like this. That is really hard when you're at a degree of separation.
And that physical rapport with the person, actually being with them, you know, it's a relationship, which, yes, I just love it, this time we're having now. You know, I know you anyway, so I've had that time with you. So it's sort of, icing. But if we never met, I mean, it wouldn't be the same, would it?
Yeah.
So I must admit, I mean, to be honest with you, I did 6 weeks ago. I really didn't have any time for try and do this online, but I must admit I'm intrigued. I think it's there's opportunities here which actually in some ways open doors up which I'd not thought of. So for example, you know, when you've got, say, a group of 10 students trying to watch you demonstrate something, the ones sat at the back haven't got a clue, and they've all got their phones out trying to record it precisely because they can't see it, and they're trying to listen to you. So actually, and I'll be honest, having to prepare my materials beforehand is a real discipline. Whereas, you know, the number of times you can just sort of waltz in and sort of wing it because, you know, something else has been going on and you're sort of cramming the teaching in between other things. So it does mean you have to be quite disciplined in your preparation, but it does mean that you can really give quality demonstrations so people really can see what it is you're doing. And what I found, it because I've had the same people returning for one course after another, one session after another, they've begun to be aware of each other. And so it's not the same as when you've gone to a residential somewhere and you get a chance to sit down over the lunch and, you know, in the evenings you build relationships. That's a very special thing, and I think an important thing. But for the actual educational process, you do have a certain amount of familiarization of a contextual relationship. And I think there is something here, especially for those of us in the West, where everybody is scattered, and the opportunities to have that wider cultural context, say like in St. Petersburg or Athens, is lost to us. And maybe it's a question of both and, you know, good Catholic principle. And that this little coronavirus has thrown up and pushed us into situations like with that WhatsApp group or whatever, of having tools that otherwise we couldn't have been bothered with.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to keep it going even after the lockdown's finished. It's become its own thing. It's become something other.
I was impressed with what you were telling me about your setup, Ian, with your 2 cameras, so you can be further away or switch to the close-up one. And I think I'll try to set that up for my demonstrations when I'm actually teaching my live students. As you say, if you've got 12, then some of them can't see closely, but also I'd like to see the demonstration again. So I think I will set up a video camera so that we can project it straight onto the television for those who can see more that way while I'm demonstrating. We'll record it so that, so I think you're whetting my appetite to try to develop that more. I found the only weakness of the video is your response. It's not so much demonstrating, but it's the response, the critique of people's work, how to point things out accurately. I realised in Zoom, you've got those, you can actually draw on people's paintings. At 10 o'clock today, I was doing a tutorial with one of my students, and I'd realised that with Zoom, you could actually draw on their picture on the screen. So you can actually point to things quite specifically if you're doing screen share. So there are a lot of skills one can learn in Zoom. To annotate things.
And I think one of the things which struck you, like for example with Ivan being in touch and saying, "Oh, thank you for this conversation," the world of iconography is fairly small. And I know when I first came across icons when I was 18, and there was no internet, and you know I wasn't at art college, so I didn't even know where you could get materials from for many, many years. Now we've got this wonderful way that instead of having these little people scattered, we can really be gathering people. And the question is, who does the gathering? So, you know, there's some people who maybe are putting themselves out as being masters of iconography, but I'd have some questions about, say, their theology or something like this. And it is difficult to have a friendly conversation which doesn't become, having an argument with somebody or putting them down or whatever. But if you've got a networking like this sort of forum where people can come together and have conversations and really listen to one another, I think that's another important way in which we can raise the game, if we put it that way, because you're companioning each other and establishing good practice and a consensus, which especially, how many of those who participate in the courses we've taught in the past 10 years have gone on to be masters? Probably not so many. But all that education that they've had, I am sure for probably 80% will have raised the game in terms of their understanding of what a good icon is, how icons work in the liturgy, a sense that this is a real treasure of the church. And all of this shouldn't be underestimated because, in this secularized, de-Christianized environment that we live in, anything that's proclaiming the gospel has to be of value. So we're evangelists in this way. And even if it falls on stony ground, at least the seed is being cast liberally. And I think that's, I think all three of you have been pioneers really in really opening up the world of iconography beyond just the sort of esoteric small groups of, say, Orthodox or Copts or Catholics or whatever, to really sort of create. So I think I'd really want to say, I think for all the drawbacks and, the frustrations, I do think you've all three of you been doing an incredibly important job.
But I also think that those people who've been your students, it's not just about their being students. They become, certainly in the case of my group at St. Peter's, they become an incredibly close-knit, mutually supportive community of their own. And they, they've made, such leaps of understanding and such continued valued relationships with people that they wouldn't have had. They might not go on to be great iconographers, but they've got this community, this other thing which is of enormous spiritual value to their their life as Christians.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's really touching, really seeing the development of relationships between my 12 certificate students and how it carries on after the course is finished.
Yes, very much. Yeah.
Some of them become Christians or become more active Christians. It's a joy to see. Yeah.